Okay. And all of the works that you've the that you were in, you were primarily focused on the software side of things.
I would say that's accurate. Yeah. Yeah.
And so, something I'm quite curious about is you said that you worked in a lot of the companies that a lot of the startups that ended up failing, and you wrote some of the earliest codes for things like for many of the things that we take for granted today, like you said parallel computing, network routing, digital transaction security, and deep web page analysis. And
Yeah.
if you look at, if you kind of compare the level of sophistication of those technologies now and how complex they are, or how much they have changed, do you feel that there's a huge change between now and when it was first successfully developed?
Well, complexity comes in different forms. And so the there are refinements that make it so that something that works as a sort of a research project.
I think we are losing a bit of connection here. Let's see.
Now I would say there's a lot more sort of standard processes for how to create a piece of software that will robustness, um,
Uh-huh.
and which can involve the work of more than one person. In other words, working groups. Things the concepts behind GitHub, for example, are 10 years ago it was uncommon for even industry professionals to be that familiar with it. I mean, at that point they did. 20 years ago, it was uncommon, and you certainly 20 years ago wouldn't have even thought of having students using GitHub. 10 years ago, it was novel for have students using GitHub. Now,
Okay.
everyone uses GitHub,
Yeah.
um,
Uh-huh.
and so that's just one example of an increasing level of understanding and literacy throughout the population for how to use a particular technology. That in turn makes it so that the software that you produce is more mature earlier, and it can and can be developed by more people. Um, so I would say that that's the main source of increased sophistication. But the complexity in terms of how hard did you have to think about solving a problem? You had to think harder in some ways back in 1990, because there weren't any of these tools or concepts at your disposal. You had to come up with them on your own.
And for startups nowadays, do you feel that they've kind of moved on to newer fields, or have they been both moving on to newer fields, but at the same time refining the ones uh, that you've worked on? Was it like 20
Um,
to 30 years, 30 to 40 years ago, right?
well,
Oh
yeah,
no.
I mean, so the first startup I worked for in 1988, which is what, 32 years ago. And the last startup that I personally have worked for was in 2006, which was still 14 years ago. Now, I've also seen colleagues and students and my son all work for startup companies in that 14-year time. It's a slightly different perspective, but I still think I have an idea of how these things have changed. And I would say that a couple of the things. So one of the fun facts from 1988 was when you started a startup company, and if you told an investor that your startup company was focusing on software, they wouldn't give you nearly as much financing. They wouldn't be nearly as confident in your business as if you were saying that you were actually going to build a physical piece of hardware, a physical computer, for example. That was so that was something which even then you could tell was going to change. But for the people who were the leaders of the company, who were at the time were in their 50s or 60s, people that were at that time my age now, and I was more like your age, a little older, but
Right.
basically your age.
Uh-huh.
And so in 1988, I was like, "Come on, software is going to be the thing." But they were like, "We can't get money to develop software. We have to develop hardware." Um, and so that's completely different now. So that now, of course, if you're building an app and it's promising, then you can get financing for it. And if you're building hardware, people are looking at it sketchily, like, "Wait a minute, are you going to be able to afford to support the development costs for hardware,
Right.
uh,
Right.
and be able to overcome the fact that that can be rapidly the competition can rapidly outsource the hardware out of the country and make it so that your business is undermined by that."
Yeah.
Um, so it's that particular concept has been sort of turned around. There's other issues of how startup companies are managed and led. That's changed a little bit, but not that much, I don't think.
And the thing with software is that it could be infinitely produced without increasing or even slightly increasing the cost because it's so easy to just duplicate the software over and over again, and hardware costs a lot more to produce.
Yeah, yeah. There is the margins for software are fantastic. Uh, I think in both, whether you're talking about in 1988 or you're talking about now, the rationale for the valuation was more in terms of what could a competitor do. And so in 1988, people thought, well, you could just your competitor can just copy your software, right?
Right.
Now
Uh-huh.
the intellectual property protections for software are more well established. They're not perfect, but people know what they are, right? So that it's less likely someone will just steal your software willy nilly. And meanwhile, the capacity to outsource or otherwise automate the creation of hardware now is much easier than it
Mhm.
was then. So it's all about what can your competitors do.
Uh-huh. And yes, and you talked about this a little bit before, but what was your transition from working startups to teaching like?
All right. So first of all, for the full disclosure, I didn't work startups all the time. I was most of the time that before I was an educator, I was in some capacity with NASA and ultimately a senior research scientist.
Mm.
But I certainly worked for startups a few times. And so the transition was first I was working at NASA, doing fine, but frankly a little bored, a little feeling like I wasn't
Uh-huh.
learning anything anymore. And I wanted to do something that would push myself. And so a friend of mine who was part of a startup company invited me to join their company, and I did. And of course, pretty quickly, the economy had big problems that were out of our control, and we went out of business because our product was good, but all of our customers went out of business. And so,
Oh,
no matter how good your product, if you don't have any customers, you're going out of business too. And so we did. And so that left me kind of sitting at the kitchen table with my wife saying, well, what are we going to do? Because I could have gone and searched and found another engineering job somewhere.
right.
But the economy wasn't doing so well at the time. It would have been tricky for me to find a position that was very enjoyable, very rewarding. Um, Meanwhile, she was having a lot of success at work, but she was only working half time because she was the primary caregiver for our children. And so the solution was pretty obvious: have her go from half time to full time in a job she already loved, and they already loved her. And then let me. I might consult a little bit here and there, but mostly I would take care of the kids. And then we did that transition, and so I got to walk my children to school for most of their elementary school career, and well, pretty much all of their elementary school career. And my wife got to become a highly successful Silicon Valley technical leader, and so that now she's a principal scientist at Adobe.
And when was this period? That was it in the early 2000s, just before you started teaching?
Yeah, so that transition happened. I don't remember exactly. I think it was like early 2002 well, when I stopped working for the last startup company that I was full-time, fully paid employee for. There were a couple more startup companies that I worked for after that, but they never got, either didn't get big enough to pay me, or the arrangement was temporary enough that I wasn't an employee but was just a consultant. But in any case, yeah, it was about 2002 that I went to becoming a stay-at-home dad, and then took care of the kids and stuff. And taking care of the kids got easier as time went on. And so sometime around 2005 or so, or even earlier, I joined the actually, I ran for city council. I forgot about that. I ran for city council in the city of Mountain View in 2002. Lost. And that was good, because if you're on city council, it's really bad for your health. I mean, I think those people, it's a big sacrifice just to have to sit at the table in the front of the room for 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours every week or so. And it's just, you could just see them. They just, I mean, as much as they take care of themselves, otherwise, you just look worse and worse if you're sitting up there like that. And so I was glad to not have become a city councilor,